Colin J. Stan, born with the surname Lashley, was born on December 31st, 1956 in California, United States. Despite coming from a Christian family and being a believer in God, Colin's parents were divorced, something still uncommon at that time. She grew up with her mother, her two sisters, and her stepfather, frequently visiting her father. On December 12, 1973, she married Tom Stan, a man who was 22 years old at the time, while she was only 16, about to turn 17. Imagine that they even had to ask her father's approval to carry out the ceremony. Beyond that detail, they moved in together, and from there things went downhill. The marriage didn't last very long. Her mother owned a boarding house in California, and there she met Alice and Bobby, a couple from Oklahoma with whom she became very close. In 1977, she decided to move with them to the city of Eugene in Oregon, leaving behind her husband, from whom she did not legally divorce. She just decided to leave. At just 20 years old, Colleen was a stubborn, impulsive young woman, unsure about what she wanted for her future. A young woman who only cared about the here and now. I'm not the one saying this. She says it herself in her biography, co-written with Jim Green. Colleen self-describes with these words. On the morning of May 19, 1977, Colleen decided to travel to Westwood, California, to surprise her friend Linda Smith for her birthday. She would visit her friend Sarah and sister-in-law Sandra during that trip. Despite it being a bad idea to go alone and several people warning her not to, Colleen had already decided to go. That day, she said goodbye to her boyfriend, to whom she promised to be back in Oregon by Sunday for a party with his parents, and headed to her apartment to pack her backpack. Colleen had a car in very poor condition and didn't have money for a bus ticket, so she decided to hitchhike, which in Argentina we call hacer dedo, or auto stop. She already had experience with this, as Colleen had hitchhiked before with Bobby and Alice. This wasn't her first time, and she knew perfectly well how to do it safely. In fact, she met her boyfriend at the time while doing this in the forests of Oregon. Finally, it was Alice who reached her up to Interstate 5, where her journey and the road to torture began. Colleen arrived at Interstate 5 at 7 in the morning, and she had almost 8 hours of travel to Westwood ahead of her. First, she journeyed 16.77 miles to Cottage Grove with a college student. Once there, she got out of the car and got on a truck carrying juice boxes, which took her to Red Buff. The truck was driven by two men, and one of them took advantage of Colleen, tricking her into hiding during a police check and trying to touch and kiss her. However, Colleen was not intimidated by that experience, which perhaps could have been the first big sign not to continue with the trip. By then, she had already covered 500 out of the 403.89 miles from Eugene to Westwood, so she chose to proceed. At the junction of Interstate 5 and Highway 36 in Red Buff, Colleen waited for her next ride. She declined rides from two vehicles, opting for caution following the truck driver incident, and chose not to travel solo with men. Finally, a two-door blue Dodge Colt pulled up next to Colleen. Its passengers were Cameron Hooker, a young man only 4 years older than Colleen, who was traveling with his wife Janice and their baby. Clearly, people who appeared trustworthy externally, for instance. A joyful family, just traveling and willing to offer her a ride. With this context then, now yes, we move on to the day of the events. She trusted that it was just that, a family with their baby, so Colleen decided to get into the hooker's car, who offered to take her to Westwood. They drove like this for 4 kilometers until they decided to stop at a service station in Pines Creek, where Colleen says that while she was in the bathroom, a voice in her head told her to jump out the bathroom window and run away. But she didn't listen to this intuition and returned to the hooker's car. When she sat in the back seat, Colleen saw that there was a strange wooden box next to her, which wasn't there before. That was the big last sign that she should run away, but she didn't. I'm gonna make a small parenthesis before continuing, and I want to say that sometimes intuition, the little voice in your head that tells you maybe don't go with these people, is often your brain recognizing strange attitudes without you realizing it. Colleen should have trusted her intuition, but they seemed like a normal family on the surface. Once back on the road near Lassen Volcanic National Park, the hookers asked Colleen if she minded stopping for a moment in the park to see the ice caves. Colleen said it was not an issue.
Cameron Hooker then turned right and drove down a dirt road into the forest until he reached the stream.
The hookers exited the car while Colleen remained inside. That's when it all began. But instead of telling you, I'm going to read what he wrote. I looked out the window and could see the woman and the baby in the stream, but the man was nowhere in sight. For just a second, I had lost track of him. Suddenly, the seat in front of me was thrown forward and the man jumped into the back seat with me. A large, sharp butcher knife was in his hand and pressing against my throat. "Put your hands on your head," he ordered. I froze in fear. All I could think was, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening to me. I was petrified and I couldn't move. My mind was in a state of shock as adrenaline began to pump through my veins. "Put your hands on your head," he said again as he pushed the knife harder against my throat. I did what he told me. Unconsciously, I realized that we were both shaking. I was shaking from fear, while he was probably shaking from nervousness. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his backpack and showed them to me. Quickly, one wrist and then the other were handcuffed behind my back. Now I was trapped with no escape. I feared this was the beginning of the end for me. I was about to die. The man held the knife to my throat once more. "Are you gonna do what I tell you?" I was petrified and couldn't speak, so I could only nod my head. Then he secured a cloth blindfold over my eyes. He put something over my head and face that fit like a harness. A broad leather strap enveloped my mouth and head. Another strap passed under my jaw. 2 additional straps went up the sides of my nose and joined on my forehead. From my forehead, the strap continued over the top of my head and secured to the wide strap at the back of my head. Now my jaw was securely locked in place, preventing me from opening my mouth to scream. Lastly, he tied my ankles together with a rope. The speed and precision of his movements indicated that the man was well rehearsed. This was not an ad hoc kidnapping. Instead, the man had placed the restraints in his car in advance. I thought about the situation and realized that the couple had been hunting prey and I was their catch. My mind was still in shock. I couldn't believe my situation. Unbeknownst to me, the toughest part was still ahead. Now the purpose of the strange box in the back seat next to me became evident. The 20-pound box served as a trap with a round hole designed to fit around my neck. With the box in the open position, half of the semicircle was on the lid, while the other half was on the base of the box. 2 latches secured the main box, preventing light sounds and fresh air from entering. The human head contains 4 of the 5 senses. Inside the box, my vision, hearing, taste, and smell were suppressed and eliminated. My vision was of darkness, the sound was muffled, the taste was of a leather gag, and the smell was of foam and carpet. My sense of touch was not affected by the head box. I could feel the suffocating device on my head, the handcuffs on my wrist, and the rope on my ankles. Since the woman said nothing, I concluded that she knew about the plot to kidnap me in advance. For an unknown reason, she put the baby on the sleeping bag over me. When the baby started crying, she took it back. I could feel the car moving over the dirt road and turning right onto the highway. We headed west back over the mountain towards Red Buff. Since I couldn't hear the man or woman speaking, I assumed they were driving in silence. Even if they spoke, I'm uncertain if I could have heard them. We drove until the car abruptly took several sharp turns and stopped. The engine stopped, the man exited while the woman and baby remained in the car with me. Shortly, the man returned and it seemed the woman with the baby presumably exited and left. Now I was alone with the man who sat in the back seat with me, opening the main box. "Sit," he commanded sternly. "Will you follow my instructions?" "Yes," I replied, teeth clenched behind the gag. My ankles were untied, but the gag, the blindfold, and my hands remained tied. Once outside, he ordered to get out of the car. He took me by the shoulders from behind and led me forward. That's how Colleen was kidnapped and taken to the hooker's house, where they took her to the basement. It's from this point in the video where I'm going to ask for your discretion for what I'm about to describe. Know that here begins the ugliest and most descriptive part of the case, so if you want to skip it, I'll leave the minutes in the video here on the screen or below in the timeline you can see it. Once in the basement, they stripped her and hung her from the ceiling by her wrists. Then the hookers proceeded to have sex in front of her while Cameron Hooker whipped her with a whip. Thus began long months of torture, where Colleen spent almost all the hours of the day tied up in the basement and with her head inside that sensory box. Once a day around 8 in the evening, Cameron Hooker would go down to the basement to torture her in different ways. He usually hung her from the wrist to the ceiling, but he also whipped and groped her. Once he tried to electrocute her unsuccessfully. Beneath her, Colleen had a support that Hooker would sometimes remove to watch her kick the air, held up only by her wrists. After the hanging torture, Hooker would put her in the box, which in turn had a box specially designed for her head, which, although it did not require her to support its weight with her body due to its position, hurt to have it on, mainly because she couldn't breathe. After complaining and complaining for hours inside this box, Hooker asked her what was wrong, and when she told him, begging him to let her breathe, he locked her up again and with an object she couldn't identify, made it even tighter so that her ribs couldn't expand and therefore made it even harder for her to breathe. You may be wondering then, who is Cameron Hooker? Cameron Hooker was born in Altares, California on November 5, 1953. His parents had moved from Arkansas in search of a better life. Harold and Lorena Hooker were simple people, a lower-class family that barely had enough to eat. As Cameron grew up, they moved every 2 or 3 years. His father sought work in construction or sawmills, something he would copy in his adult life, and his mother generally stayed at home to take care of him and his younger brother Dexter. While Cameron Hooker and his brother lived relatively good lives and were cared for by their parents, what affected them most at that time was having to move constantly. Hooker was initially written as a cheerful and quiet child, but sometimes also very friendly. He was the type of boy who joked with his classmates to make them laugh. His sociable side seems to have completely changed, however, when the Hooker family bought a property south of Red Bluff in 1969 and finally put their mobile home in a permanent direction. In his new school and having already hit his growth spurt, Hooker began to be bullied, pushed aside because he didn't look conventionally attractive or because he didn't dress fashionably. At this point, he didn't have friends or engage in extracurricular activities. What he did do was go to workshop classes, use tools and machines to build. In all other aspects, he didn't stand out much. By that time, Hooker had begun to fantasize. He especially desired to have complete control over another person. He wanted someone to fear him. This fixation grew more and more, adding everything that pornography taught him. He sought brutality, possession, and to add specific objects to torture his sexual victims, although of course he was far from accomplishing something like that at that moment. When he graduated from high school in 1972, Cameron Hooker began working at the local sawmill Diamond Lands Corporation. However, his attitude remained the same. He remained a quiet man and unattractive to the women around him. But while this was happening on the outside, in Hooker's mind, he was still the dominant man of a bunch of women who were punished by his fantasies. He had begun to plan to turn his fantasies into reality. In 1973, a mutual friend introduced him to Janice, a naive and insecure young woman with curly brown hair, glasses, and immature. After all, she was just 15 years old. Being much younger than Hooker, he didn't find her threatening, and what others saw as a man with not much to offer, to Janice, he seemed like someone irresistible. At school, other boys mistreated her. No one had been as kind to her as this new person she had met. So they started dating, doing couple things. They had several things in common, but mainly that they didn't have many friends and they didn't really stand out, but also that neither of them was originally from Red Bluff. Janice's family had moved from the San Jose area a few years earlier. They had settled into a tiny house not far from the Hookers with a garden and not much else. Like Hooker, Janice lived in a rural environment and grew up in a family that didn't place much emphasis on education and never had much money. Janice was the youngest of 4 children and doesn't remember her parents as warm or demonstrative. Her father, always working and rarely home, paid her little attention. Neither did her mother, whom she describes as a strict and reproachful woman. Janice was primarily taken care of by her older sister, Lisa. Lisa took care of her and taught her to sew, but Janice says she also harbored feelings of jealousy and resentment towards her older sister. She felt that Lisa was always the favorite. Janice was seeking attention. When she was still quite young, Janice had an epileptic seizure and linked it to her parents' lack of attention. She thought her father believed people with epilepsy were possessed by demons, so she had to keep her distance from him. Whatever the cause, Janice remembers feeling rejected. She remembered being told she was stupid, but rarely being told she was loved. These experiences shaped a submissive and insecure personality. Her first emotional relationships with boys were marked by fear of rejection. That's why a few months after starting her relationship with Hooker, when he proposed something peculiar, she didn't hesitate as much as another person would. What Hooker proposed was that he wanted to hang her, suspend her from her wrists in a tree and without clothes. Naturally, he lied to her. He told her that his other girlfriends had let him do this, that many people did it. And of course, Janice, who was terribly afraid of rejection, thought that if she didn't do this or anything else he told her, he would leave her. So she told him yes. Hooker took her to the nearby mountains, tied her up with his handmade leather handcuffs, and hung her up. Janice was frightened by the leather handcuffs. She was in pain from cutting her wrists, radiating down her arms and back. But Hooker was so affectionate and happy when he took her down from the tree that it was easier for her to agree the next time he wanted to do the same. These trips to the forest became regular events. Several times a month, he took Janice to Tejama County Forest for experiments. Cameron would tie her up, stake her to the ground or to the branches of the trees. She didn't like it. It hurt. It was uncomfortable, but she simply endured it because once it was over, Hooker would become very affectionate and happy. The temporary pain seemed worthwhile. He soon started using whips and beat her. Not strong enough to leave permanent marks. He was careful about that, just welts. She didn't think Hooker would actually hurt her, and he seemed to know what he was doing. So when he wanted to tie her up and submerge her in the creek, she agreed. It was a horrible experience, a brush with death by drowning that Janice would never forget. Still, she was too scared to tell her parents. She was too scared to tell anyone else what was going on. But especially to them, who didn't even seem to care about other aspects of her life. The sex, the beatings, the pictures he took of her. She knew it wasn't right. Telling them all this could get her punished and forced to leave Hooker forever. And Janice didn't want that. No matter how much he tortured her at times, he was still the kindest boy she had ever known in her life. He was also the person who had given her the most attention so far, and she clearly didn't want to lose him and the security he provided. Aside from these times when he sexually tortured her to satisfy his fantasies, the rest of the relationship was quite normal. Being older than her, Hooker showed her places she had never seen, things she had never done, which further reinforced Janice's dependence on him. After more than a year together, Janice decided to do something to keep Hooker from losing interest in her, so she told him she was pregnant and that they needed to get engaged. Of course, her being pregnant was a lie. Imagine the impression Hooker left on Janice's family that they let her get married at 16 while her older sister had to wait until she was of age. Janice's parents were thrilled about this marriage, or rather, as she perceived it, her parents wanted to get rid of her, so they had given Hooker permission to take her away, and they also gave them $500 as a wedding gift so they wouldn't come back for a while. They married in Reno, Nevada on January 18, 1975. Perhaps the wedding had been too hopeful for the life they both were looking to have. Janice dropped out of high school at 17, and Hooker said he would follow the path of a builder or lumberjack. But that was nothing more than a distraction for the real goal in his life, which was to capture more women to fulfill all his perversions. So it goes without saying that they didn't have lives full of luxuries. They moved into a low-cost apartment and carried on with their marital life. Behind what their neighbors could see, there was a couple of sadists. Or rather, that's what Hooker was looking for, experimenting day by day with even worse things. There were times when in the middle of their sessions, Hooker would strangle Janice until she fainted. Not long after they got married, when Janice and Hooker had a fight, he got so angry that he put a knife to her throat and asked her if she wanted to die. On another occasion, he showed her a news article, which he apparently collected about the horrible crucifixion, and told her that if he ever killed her, that's how he would do it. Janice found it harder to dismiss the chance of her husband potentially killing her. For the first 2 years of marriage, she tried to fulfill her husband's strange fantasies, becoming increasingly submissive to his demands. But when Hooker pulled out an army gas mask with the eyes and ventilation holes taped over, she resisted. The mask clearly terrified her, and Hooker had to gag her to prevent her from screaming when he put it over her head, evidently against her will. Hooker's experiments seemed to become increasingly violent, more bizarre. Although they were afraid to confront him and refuse, Janice was no longer as interested in participating. It was too painful. Perhaps Janice's fear made her a less exciting partner, or maybe Hooker was simply getting bored of her. It seems to be either way that one person was not enough to satisfy his cravings. In any case, Hooker began to talk about a fantasy he had had for a long time. He wanted to bring a third person into the house, another woman who would submit to his sadomasochistic experiments, a girl who couldn't say no. Essentially, he suggested kidnapping a girl and expected Janice's approval. Hooker used to read the newspaper a lot, and for a moment he thought he could place an ad and perhaps attract someone who wasn't exactly forced. Although there were a few problems, which mostly fell on the collection. Newspaper publishing was costly, especially with details. It could also happen that whoever responded wanted money in exchange. So she spent her days thinking about how to finally start doing what she wanted. While Hooker was concerned about the logistics of finding and keeping another woman, Janice was worried that this third person would be a threat to her marriage. Despite these habits they had, Janice still felt that she loved her husband. Her dependence on Hooker was so high that life without him seemed unimaginable. So, even though the idea of him focusing the most painful acts, especially the hangings, on another person relieved her, she insisted that there should be no sexual relations between her husband and this other woman. They were husband and wife, and as she saw it, true intimacy should be reserved only for them. Hence, the idea arose that they could only have anal sex so as not to betray the marriage. It's not exactly clear how or when it happened, but eventually Hooker and Janice came to an agreement. The deal was, if he could kidnap someone, she could too. She wanted a baby. By then, they had been together for a good while and had found a better home. It was on 1140 Oak Street. It was a small house with 2 bedrooms, front and back yards, wooden floors, a dining room, and a basement. The basement was very small, but it would serve for what they needed. With boards from the diamond sawmill where he worked, Hooker built a wide table that would serve as a platform. He put hooks in each corner so that the leather handcuffs he had made could be easily fastened when he wanted to keep an eye on Janice. He put additional hooks on a beam in the ceiling to hang and then built the main box. It was a strong and heavy contraption, surprisingly heavy, with large metal hinges and double walls. He had Janice come down to test it, and indeed the neck hole was the right size and closed as it should. Actually, that's what he thought, and I guess what he wanted to happen, but it was a very, very tight hole. Anyway, not everything he did turned out as he planned. Although Hooker's preparations were many and his plans were well thought out, finding the right person was not so easy. Janice became pregnant and had her baby, a girl, in the fall of 1976, but Hooker had still not managed to fulfill his part of the deal by then. He had all the equipment ready in the car. He had even stalked some women, taken pictures of them, but none of them had worked out. Every time he was about to succeed, something went wrong, but on May 19, 1977, Cameron Hooker's luck changed. At the end of his shift at Diamond, he came home from work as usual around 4. He took his wife and baby for a drive. They drove around for about half an hour and then he saw her. Standing on the side of Antelope Boulevard was Colleen's stand. Hooker stopped and offered to give her a ride. The rest of the story you already know. Colleen trusted them, and perhaps if they hadn't had a baby, she would never have gotten into that car.
Yes, I thought I was going to die because I had terrible claustrophobia and I found it very hard to breathe. I just cried and begged God. Cameron was torturing me once. He had me hanging in the basement and he came up to me and said, "Dare to scream and I'll cut your vocal cords. I've done it before."
What do you think about that?
Your mind can take you anywhere. And I've heard many prisoners of war say they did the same thing as me. And you just have to go somewhere else in your mind. I thought about my family. I went on picnics with my family. I went on vacation with my family.
In her first month in the basement box, Colleen was only given a plate of food and water. They didn't wash her or clean her teeth. She had also stopped menstruating. She spent her days observing her surroundings. For example, every morning she could hear a car leaving. In this way, she had begun to recognize when it was day and when it was night. Janice sometimes offered drinks or spoke distantly, but she was just a shadow to Colleen. It was only after 3 months that Hooker decided it would be a good idea to give the young woman a bath. Naturally, he seized the chance to act perversely. He put his camera in the bathroom, approached Colleen, tied her hands behind her back, covered the blindfold she had on her eyes with tape, covered her mouth, and tied her legs to a broomstick. Then he put her face down in the water. Colleen couldn't get up because the broomstick, lodged on the edge of the tub, prevented her from lifting her knees beneath her. Hooker submerged her head until she could no longer hold her breath. When she began gulping water after the bubbles ceased, he dunked her underwater again by her hair. As he dunked her over and over, he took the opportunity to focus his camera, which he had already loaded with film and had at hand, and take some pictures. He dunked her over 20 times, snapping photos. When she was finally allowed to sit and catch her breath, she began to breathe with great pain. By Hooker's orders, Janice had to fix Colin's hair, or at least try to. Really, sweating in a box for 5 months without grooming is a good way to make hair terribly dirty and knotted. It was tangled, matted, and dirty, and the tape had also left a sticky residue on it. Regular hair conditioner only had a negligible effect, so Janice tried to put vegetable oil on it. She still couldn't comb through the knots, so she gave up and took the scissors. She cut one knot and then another until she finally cut about 4.72 inches of hair. Months later, in January 1978, things changed when Colleen was taken out of the box and Hooker forced her to sign a contract where she agreed to be his slave. In that contract, it was established that Colleen's new name would be Kay or Kay and that she could only refer to Hooker as master. She was also forbidden to speak unless spoken to directly. This slave contract was nothing more than an invention he had seen in one of his magazines. More roleplay style than something real, but he copied it with a rented typewriter and showed it to Colleen as if it were real. She explained to him that the company knew he was there and that he had to sign. This group was supposed to be in charge of human trafficking and the sale of slaves, and that if he didn't sign, then they would take her away. To prevent this, he needed to register her. The situation seemed odd to Colleen, but in his position, he couldn't oppose much. He eventually signed, but only after asking several questions. It was from that contract that Hooker began to violate Colleen several times a day. However, out of respect for his wife, there was never vaginal penetration. Instead, Hooker dedicated himself to violating her anally and orally. It was also in that same year when the family moved to a mobile home in Red Bluff, California. This is the point where Colleen's situation shifts to match the title. Since there was no basement in this place, she was locked in a coffin under the Hooker's bed for the rest of her captivity years, only letting her out of this box a few hours of the day to feed her, let her go to the bathroom, and obviously abuse her. Even Colleen was locked in the coffin under the bed, while Janice Hooker gave birth to her second child right above her. Colleen endured this way for 7 years kidnapped, and it was not only because of the conditions in which they kept her, but also because Hooker had told her that they were part of a sect called the Company, which was tracking Colleen's family. In this way, Hooker threatened to harm her family and friends if she tried to rebel or escape. It was precisely this fear that her family would be harmed that made Colleen extremely obedient to everything the Hookers asked of her. Gradually, over time, she managed to gain more freedom and not spend so many hours in the coffin.
There even came a time when Colleen would walk around the house and garden.
Despite having multiple instances where she could have escaped, the fear she had for her family prevented her from doing so. Colleen was so cooperative with the Hookers that they even let her visit her family in 1981. She and Cameron Hooker, posing as her boyfriend, visited her parents. Both deceived Colleen's parents into believing that she had run away of her own free will, but the family believed she was involved in a cult due to her handmade clothes and her way of behaving. To recap, Colleen was kidnapped against her will because she believed a cult was following her family. And Colleen's family, for their part, didn't know she was kidnapped, but believed that she was the one involved in a cult. By that time, Colleen was also known as part of the family by neighbors and friends, but the Hookers said she was the nanny living in the house with them. Some time ago, the couple's second daughter was born and they needed more help, so in a way it seemed believable. Either way, the visit to Colleen's parents was too much for Cameron Hooker, who believed she was giving too much freedom to his slave. So after that visit, they cut off all the freedom she had obtained, and she spent 3 years locked up almost 24 hours a day in the coffin. In 1983, Colleen was introduced to the couple's daughters and given certain freedoms again. She even got them to let her work at a motel. 7 years later, there was trust between Janice and Colleen. Both knew they were very afraid of him and everything he came up with to do. Then Hooker's new plan heightened Janice's distress. He called it the alternate night system. No matter how he used the Bible to justify it, it seemed sinful and wrong to her. He announced to the women that with this new system, he would sleep with one of them for 2 nights, with the other for the next 2 nights, and with whoever he wanted for the remaining 3. He tried to frame this as a proposal, as if they had the option to do whatever they wanted during their nights, but both women knew that if they didn't do what Hooker wanted, they would be punished. They were very clear that there really was no other alternative with him. In an attempt to simply end it all, Janice asked Hooker to strangle her to death. She thought that since he had done it several times, leaving her unconscious, this would be an easy task, but in the end, Hooker strangled her without killing her. After this, Janice had nothing to lose. If the worst thing that could happen was that Hooker ended up killing her, there wasn't much more to do. Janice then made a decision. Everything came to an end in 1983 when Cameron Hooker wanted Colleen to be his second wife. This was the last straw for Janice. Despite having been an accomplice to her husband, Janice had also been physically, psychologically, and sexually tortured by her husband since the first time they met, and that's why she endorsed the kidnapping of Colleen, as this way she didn't have to suffer all those tortures. It took her months to decide. She thought for a long time whether she should leave, whether she should free Colleen, whether they could leave together, until, tired of her situation and Colleen's, on Thursday, August 9th, 1984, she arrived at King's Lodge around 11:30 in the morning. She went to the motel room where the woman was working at that moment, gathered her courage, and finally told her what she had wanted to confess for so long. Said Kay, which is what they called Colleen. I must inform you, Cameron has been lying about everything. The company, the contract, the slavery, everything he told you about me being a slave, all of that were lies. He lied to scare you so you would continue to be his slave. Colleen was horrified that someone could lie so constantly, so convincingly as Cameron Hooker had done. She cried out of shock and disbelief. Janice also cried, saying over and over how sorry she was. She apologized to him at that moment for everything she had put him through. They chose to consult Pastor Dabney, a known acquaintance, due to their ongoing uncertainty. Janice scheduled an afternoon appointment with the pastor and left. Colin returned to his tasks of making beds and cleaning bathrooms as he had resigned at that very moment, but his boss asked him to at least finish the work of that day. About 2 hours later, Janice came back to pick up Colin, who said goodbye and asked Mrs. Myron, his manager in charge, to please hold his next paycheck until he could send a new address, as all the money she received from this job actually went to Hooker, and she no longer wanted that to happen. When they arrived at the church, the pastor had a hard time understanding because they were really very upset. But he found out that Colleen had been held against her will, that both had been subjected to strange sexual practices, and that both were terrified of Hooker. Dabney advised them to pack their bags and leave that house immediately. She suggested they go to their homes and stay with their parents, but it wasn't that simple. It was approaching 4 o'clock, Hooker's quitting time, Janice explained, and she was supposed to pick him up from work as usual. There was no time to gather their things before that time, and they were afraid to confront him. The pastor then told them to pick him up. The pastor then told them to act normal, to pick him up from work as usual, pretend that nothing had happened, and then they left the next day, after Hooker had gone to work. That's their decision. Colin thought in the middle that Janice's will might fail, and she might confess to her husband what she had done. In reality, the only thing to do was to trust. They picked up Hooker as usual, made dinner, ate, and prepared to go to sleep after cleaning up. The usual everyday thing, Janice slept on the floor with Colleen that night, saying she didn't want to go to bed with Hooker because she felt sick. The next morning, Hooker left for work at 5 in the morning, and as soon as he walked out the door, Janice and Colleen started packing. When Kathy and Dawn, that is, the couple's daughters, got up, they sent them to Sunday school, and no longer having to worry about that detail, the two women finished the job quickly. They had finished by noon. They gathered their belongings, picked up the girls, and fled the house to Janice's parents' house in the nearby town of Gerber. Once there, they talked about staying together, about trying to form a good home for the girls. They tried to make plans, and Janice really wanted Colin to stay with her and her daughters. As you'll see, she was quite dependent. Colleen knew she was free, and her mind urged her to take advantage and go as far as possible. So she decided to call her father, who of course was surprised that his daughter, who suddenly hadn't spoken to him in years, would call him. She briefly told him she wanted to return and asked for $100 for the bus. He excitedly asked her if she didn't even want more money, but she said that would be enough. The next morning, after Colleen had her ticket in hand and was sure she would board the bus to go home at that moment, she called Cameron Hooker. That was her independence declaration. She told him, "I just wanted to tell you that I'm leaving, that I know you lied about everything and that you can no longer keep me here." Colleen doesn't remember everything the man said, but what she does remember is that Hooker cried. Unfortunately for Janice, things weren't that easy. She didn't tell her family much, so they thought she was exaggerating and it was just a couple's fight, so they encouraged her to go back home, and she did. But when she returned, she knew she really didn't want to be there. For his part, Hooker, apparently regretful, had promised to change, had started going to church with his wife, and even said he wanted to do therapy if necessary, which clearly was the case. But none of this could fully convince Janice. By the way, for a while they also kept in touch with Colleen at Janice's request, as Hooker was supposedly remorseful, but she didn't pay much attention to it and never really came back. It was Janice herself who finally reported Hooker 3 months after Colleen escaped. They believed that she had wanted to leave for a very long time. When Hooker started talking about wanting more sex slaves, she had one foot out the door, but fear and her daughters made her stay. Considering all the information, it's unsurprising that Janice exposed the situation, without which Colleen may not have experienced freedom. The guilt had been too much from the start. She even had to leave the house and escape to her sister's place for a while because she could no longer bear the weight of what was happening with her husband. While she didn't like Colleen being tortured, she also didn't like being the center of that perverse tension. But she also felt a lot of jealousy. She didn't want her husband to be interested in anyone else. This was part of her abandonment issues. She had to overcome these things to expose the crime. Moreover, by then, Janice had 2 daughters to look after. Everything posed a risk to her future and couldn't persist this way. In a moment of intense fear and anger, Janice confided in the pastor, who subsequently called the police. The sheriff initially told her that she was basically also involved and would be prosecuted as a hooker, but the next day she was informed that she had been granted immunity and could go to the police station to tell her whole story. And so she did. Of course, what she said greatly surprised the sheriff and surprised all the people who later found out about what had happened over all those years. It was 7 years of torture, but she also told something more. Janice not only reported Colleen's kidnapping, but also confessed that a year earlier, in January 1976, her husband had also kidnapped another girl, Mary Elizabeth Spanhaig, whom he tortured just like Colleen, but with the difference that he later killed her.
The body
of this young woman was never found, so no charges were brought in that case. But Hooker was indeed brought to trial for the kidnapping of Colleen and received a sentence of 104 years in prison in 1985. Currently, Cameron Hooker remains in prison for his crime. For her part, Colleen continued with her life. To this day, she is part of an organization that helps abused women and has decided to help women like her. Her story is shared in her autobiography, various documentaries, and popular culture references. In fact, the tortures that Hooker subjected Colleen to came from a French erotic book called The Story of O, which was his inspiration. The only difference is that the protagonist of the book performed all those sexual acts consensually. Currently, both Colleen and Janice live in California, but they have no contact with each other.
now that they have so many years, it's like another life, you know? And this is my new life.
And that's all for today. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this case and what other cases you want me to cover on the channel. Here are the patrons and the channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those platforms. And with nothing else to say, here is a new video, here is a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face, and see you in another video. Goodbye. Subtitled by Jane Quill.